Hey, Kels.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell them what's happening in today's episode?
In today's episode, we are going to be talking with Leah Chang. She is a historian who has written a book on 3 young queens in European history.
Sweet. Let's get into this.
All right.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
All right, Brooke, have you heard of Mary Queen of Scots?
Yes, I have.
Okay. What do you know about her?
She's really impactful to several different wars.
Yeah.
And the division of Ireland and Scotland and England, something in there. Yeah, I'm going to go really high pitch and pretend I know.
Yeah. So she's Queen of Scotland, and she's cousin to Queen Elizabeth.
Yep.
And the first, the OG.
Yeah.
Her life ends with Queen Elizabeth accusing her of treason and chopping her head off.
Yikes.
Yeah. Aggressive.
Day.
So what's often lost about her is that she becomes queen at a really, really, really young age.
Yeah, wasn't she like 12?
I don't know off the top of my head. I believe Leah tells us, so we'll have to hold that thought. But she's really young, and she's actually sent to France to be raised because she's, she's an orphan.
I think I've watched a very bad show that tries to document her life, because doesn't she marry a king in Scotland? Like young, but they're both young.
She's betrothed to the King of France.
King of France. Okay.
Yeah. And the king's mom is Catherine de Medici, who is also a very famous queen and also young, a young mom. And Catherine has a daughter who I honestly know very little about, Elisabeth de Valois, and her daughter is married off and becomes Queen of Spain. And so you've got this Queen of France, Queen Regent of France, this Queen Regent of Spain, and then this straight up Queen of Scotland.
All under the same roof
in these early years. And just what a cool story to highlight 3 women,
So I think there's a WB show called Rain.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. This is where I'm I don't think that's historical.
It is so not. And so
but there's a lot of teen sex.
That is true.
It's very Dawson's Creek in France. In France, yeah. Anyways, all right, maybe don't use that show as a reference.
It's
but
not a good reference.
It's all coming back.
So I'm really excited for those of you who have seen that show to actually
get an accurate moment of this.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm excited. This is very interesting to me. I'm excited.
So let's have Leah introduce herself.
My name is Leah Redmond Chang. I am a scholar and a former professor, and have just written a book that is called Young Queens, Three Renaissance Women and the Price of Power.
3 queens. And who are your 3 queens?
My 3 queens are from the Renaissance. So we're talking the 1500s, the 16th century. They are Catherine de Medici, who was the queen consort of France and then the queen mother. Her daughter, Elisabeth de Valois, who's the queen consort of Spain, and Catherine's daughter-in-law, who is Mary Queen of Scots, who is both the queen consort of Spain, of France, and the reigning queen of Scotland. And by queen consort, I should clarify what I mean by that. That means that these women are the wives of kings, unlike Mary Stuart, who is the sovereign queen of Scotland, which means that she rules in her own right over Scotland.
Yeah, she's so cool. Well, so I have to add that there's a show on the Stars about Catherine de Medici, and I'm really excited. I watched that show, and I'm really excited for you to set me straight here, because I know it's not accurate, but I still love it.
Well, it's really Stars. The Serpent Queen is definitely playing into a certain mythologized view of Catherine de Medici, which has been really, really hard to let go. It's something that's persisted over centuries. We just love this view of Catherine de Medici. I think we really like a bad girl and an evil queen. But there are a lot of these mythologies floating around about all of these women. So sometimes it can be really hard to get at the truth.
Well, we do have a lesson plan on our website asking, whether she really was a dark queen. And I think people would enjoy checking that out. But I'm excited to share with them a bit more about your book, because I think this could be a really interesting way to, engage students in a longer narrative, and especially getting these three women together. Like what an undertaking. So I'm really impressed about you. So why do you think this is such an important topic, these three women in particular, for teachers to bring into the classroom?
I think there's a way, I could say a couple of things. First of all, I think there's a way in which when we look this far back into history, there's a kind of flattening that happens around historical characters, men and women, but especially the women. It's really easy to kind of forget that these were real people with real emotions and very, very complex lives, that they're not just sort of black and white, evil or good characters. So one of the things that I set out to do with this book is to create a really full portrait, a very intimate portrait of these women, and to kind of show what it was like to be young and female and royal in the Renaissance. So in that sense, it's really a kind of a different view that works against traditional history. But the other thing, because I was setting out to do this complex portrait of women, the book tries to look at history from a female perspective, not only talking about issues that would have been important to women. And particularly when I say women, I should qualify, for the most part in this book, these are young girls, these are teenagers. So issues that would have been important to teenage girls, some which seem really different from concerns that we would have today, but some which seem awfully similar, actually. I think in that sense, it's a different there's a different agenda, a different way of telling history, a different methodology that starts to unfurl in the book, rather than thinking about, say, the major events such as the Reformation or the Italian Wars or the Wars of Religion from a male-dominant point of view. It's looking at some of these things through a female perspective.
I really like that you take time to emphasize how they're young, how they're teenagers. And I think, when you're in teaching young people, it's always nice to draw in those examples of no, these are people like your age doing these things. That's so cool. So I could see it being a really relatable topic for young learners.
I think that we often forget. I know for myself, when I was a professor, when I was researching these women, I forget how young they actually are when they're in the middle of these events. And so for me, it was a discovery process as well to remember, oh yeah, when Mary Stuart is meeting with the Protestant leader, John Knox, she's only 18. Or when Elisabeth de Valois gets married, she's only 13. What does that actually look like? So I was forced to ask myself these questions and to kind of reset, my understanding of the period over and over again in writing this book.
Mm-hmm. So your book is written in a sort of narrative style, and but at the same time, you've done a ton of research on these women, and you've been in the archives and you've been digging. And are you fluent in French? You must be, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I used to be a professor of French literature, so yes, that is.
This is your thing. This is what you do.
This is my thing. Yes.
So were there any sources in particular that you stumbled upon that you found really helpful? And are there any of those sources that teachers could use in the classroom with young learners to understand these women better?
Yeah, there are. So first, let me just say, actually, the fact that you brought up that I used to be a professor of French literature, that was actually really important to this project, I think, because some of the ways that we're trained in literature are a little bit different than sometimes what happens in training in history, certainly at, say, a secondary school level. In literature, we're trained to look really closely at certain details and very small details and, kind of massage them until we can kind of see what their relationship is to the much bigger picture. And this happens in history too, but it really happens in literature. And I think that for writing this book, that method was very important to me, because sometimes I would stop on a little detail, something that hadn't really been treated in the histories before, and ask myself over and over again, well, what does this mean? What is its significance? And eventually I could see and build its relationship to the bigger picture. And I think this often happens with the history of women, is that sometimes we have to look at very small, seemingly insignificant details to pull out their story. So I just want to say that. And that's why it's actually worth going back to primary texts, even primary texts that we kind of know already, and look more carefully, more closely at certain details, because certain other different stories can emerge. But for this book in particular, as you said, yes, I had to do a lot of digging in the archives in languages other than English, a lot of French, some Spanish, the Italians, especially the Venetian ambassadors, were so important to this period. So much of what we know from this period comes actually from ambassadors' reports or diplomatic letters. That's the first thing I would say. If you can find ambassadors' reports that are available to the general reader, that would be the first place to go. And the Venetians in particular are very, very important. Then another great place in English are the Calendar of State Papers, which are, by calendar, it's basically a compendium of state papers in English history. But English scholars who are putting these things together pulled a lot of resources from foreign archives as well. So you can get a really good sense of what's going on, not just in England, but also in France and Spain and Scotland by looking at the Calendar of State Papers, and they're available online. So that's really, really useful. I think because of just a broader interest now in the complexity of European history, there are more scholars who are producing short books of documents that are, extremely useful for studying the Reformation or the Renaissance in general. And one that I found so useful is actually related to an event that happens in the epilogue of my book, so kind of after the main time period of young queens, but is very important to the history of the Reformation, is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which was this huge massacre in 1572 at the site of Catherine de Medici's, or the wedding of Catherine de Medici's youngest daughter, Marguerite de Valois. And what happens is there is some sort of trigger moment, and there's a mob reaction, and thousands of Protestants are killed by Catholics in Paris. Well, Barbara Diefendorf has produced a wonderful compendium of primary documents about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, what is leading up to it, how it unfurls, and then the aftermath. And I think it's tremendous because it's one of the few widely available resources where you really hear the voices of everyday people talking about this phenomenon, which, historians really know about this. People who study the Reformation know about this, but I think that the general public in general doesn't know about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Yeah, I only recently stumbled upon this event, and one of the things that I found really interesting is that Catherine de Medici is sort of sometimes blamed for it. And where do you stand on that after all of your research?
I mean, you could really have, a whole argument with people about this. But it's really important to know that she is blamed, because that is probably one of the reasons why she's been seen as this Black queen ever since. Yeah.
Because my understanding is that she generally did a lot to create peace between Protestants and Catholics, and then this whole event is blamed on her.
Yes, she seems much more interested in compromise between the two sides, Protestants and Catholics in France. Much to the chagrin of other monarchs in Europe who did not like her policies of toleration. And a lot of a lot of Protestants and Catholics in France hated her policies of toleration too. So yeah, but she really stuck with it. And then this event happens in 1572. The truth is that we will never truly know the truth. We will never know what happened. But I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. A number of scholars tend to think that probably what happened is that there was a royal order to assassinate the Protestant leadership, to kind of, diffuse their power by eliminating the leadership. But that once the first, effort at murder happened, it just riled up a mob reaction, because Paris at the time was really on edge. Paris was a very Catholic city, and a number of Huguenots or Protestants had come into Paris for this wedding, and tensions are running really high. And of course, by that time, war has been waged in France for decades. So everyone is at their wits' end, basically, and then you can kind of see how it would happen. There's something that happens that's a trigger, and then the reaction is explosive. So I wouldn't say that Catherine is entirely innocent, but I don't believe that she actually ordered a wholesale, murder of her Protestant subjects.
Well, thank you for letting me pry into your political position.
I know it's not very satisfactory.
So that event appears in your epilogue. So tell us a little bit about the scope of your book, and how do you weave these three women's lives together?
Okay. So yes, the main action of my book, it focuses on about 23 years exactly, which is really the lifespan of Elisabeth de Valois, the young French princess who becomes the Queen of Spain. Of course,
she's
the whole
only
book is actually
23. She's only 23 years old
when she dies. Yeah, I don't know if that's a spoiler, but yes,
okay.
Yes. Yeah, I know.
They are so young. It's so
They are so young. They are so young. And definitely with Elisabeth, I often wonder what would have happened if she had lived. I really think a number of things might have been different had she lived. She really was her mother's daughter, and her mother was really training her how to be a political actor. And she was learning. And, had she lived, things might have gone quite differently. But she doesn't live. Okay. But I was saying that, so the main action, I would say, happens over her lifespan. But I do start with Catherine de Medici as a young girl. So overall, it's about 40 years, because I was very invested in depicting Catherine's experience as both a child and a young woman, because the challenges that she has to grapple with aren't really that different from the challenges that her daughter Elisabeth and her daughter-in-law Mary have to deal with. It's just that, they make slightly different choices, and the consequences of those choices look a little bit different. But the choices they all make are all in response to the same challenges, which have everything to do with the fact that they are young, female, and royal in the Renaissance. And, for all of them, the number one duty, the number one job of a queen is to get pregnant and successfully give birth to children, especially the heir. And the pressures of that, the political pressures of that, definitely take a toll on all three of them. So I wanted to start to map out, I wanted to begin with Catherine, because you see how from the very beginning, as a very, very young child, she's thrust into this political role. And then, of course, that the consequences of her being a kind of a political figure, even as a very young child, play out over really the rest of her life, and certainly affect the lives of her daughter and daughter-in-law as well.
That's really interesting. And you forget that, again, like how young they are, and they're being told, like, so think about children. You're like, I am a child.
Yeah, well, that's right. And you really see that with Elisabeth. I mean, there's, I think, to modern readers, some of her experiences, well, they sound almost abusive, but I want to say that this was this was true for all young women in the Renaissance, young royal women and aristocratic women, so not necessarily royalty, but nobility, are expected to make these dynastic marriages that further the ambition of their families, which means that they're often sent to their homes of their husbands by the time they're 14 years old. And even though, families, might try to let them mature a little bit, they're expected to sleep with their husbands by the time they're 14 or 15. So, again, these are things that to us feel almost like child abuse, but the whole system is built on this type of, transaction, this sort of market of young girls.
So what are some interesting, so you've got Catherine de Medici, she's the mother, she's the matriarch, she's got these two young women, one is her own child, one is married into her family. She must play, since these things pass on to the next generation, she must play a role in, enabling that system to continue to exist.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. They can't fight against the system, right? Exactly. Yeah. I think one thing that's important to, sort of say, and, whenever we're talking about feminism, is the ways in which women are, whether willfully or not, play into the system, right? Because they have to, So that is definitely true for Catherine, who's quite ambitious for her own children. So Catherine is Italian on her dad's side. She's a Medici. They are very wealthy. They are very powerful. They control Florence, but they're not royal, which is quite important actually to Catherine's story. But on her mother's side, she's a French princess. Her mother was a French princess. So Catherine is sort of half royal, half not, and that kind of stays with her for her entire life. And I often wonder. I would say I think that sort of having to move past that Medici legacy determines a lot of the choices that Catherine makes, including her relationship to these young women, her daughter Elisabeth and her daughter-in-law Mary. So Mary does marry into Catherine's family, but Mary first comes to France when she's 5 years old. And a lot of women are looking after Mary, the young 5-year-old Mary, including Catherine in her own way. And Catherine was very fond of the young Mary. And I should also point out too that Mary and Elisabeth were childhood friends. They shared a bedroom. So Elisabeth is she's 3 years younger than Mary, but she's one of the first children that Mary meets when Mary first comes to France. So Catherine plays a very important role in the lives of both of these young women, even though they were raised in the royal nursery, which was physically distant from where Catherine was in Paris. Catherine is a very doting mother, kind of a helicopter mom, actually. And she eventually becomes a pretty controlling mother. And I think that might be for a couple of reasons. One, because Catherine herself was an orphan, and also because it took 10 years for Catherine to get pregnant. And this was very traumatic for her because, as I said before, women are expected to bear the heir or children, and she couldn't do it. So, when she finally does get pregnant and has her children, she just loves them to death. She's almost kind of smothering. But so she plays a very important role, one that is built on duty and loyalty, but also love. Certainly between Catherine and Elisabeth, Catherine really loves her daughter Elisabeth, and Elisabeth really loves Catherine. Now, Catherine's relationship to Mary does shift because even though she's quite fond of Mary when Mary was a child, eventually politics comes in. And the important thing to know is that even though Mary is related to Catherine through marriage, she's not related by any sort of close blood kinship bond. And that is going to make all the difference one thing that Mary will discover when she's older is that blood is thicker than water. And that Catherine and Elisabeth share a certain kind of bond that Mary will never enjoy.
That's got to be tough, right? Because she's also like, this is the only home she's really known because she came when she was 5, right? So she's kind of like the ugly stepchild.
Right, except for the opposite. She's the ugly stepchild, but opposite. But you've actually hit the nail on the head, because so when Mary comes to France, first of all, she's this young reigning queen. Mary becomes the Queen of Scotland at 9 days old because her father dies, and it is kind of rare to be a girl queen, a reigning girl queen. I mean, you have boy kings in the Renaissance. You have boy kings, but you don't have as many girl queens. And on top of it, Mary is stunning. From the time she's 5 years old, she is definitely like, she's the it girl. She's tall. She's very attractive. She's very articulate. She's older than all the French royal children. So as soon as she slips in there into that French royal nursery, she kind of rules the roost. You know how there are these kids, people in general, but kids who just, I don't know, they have something. It's like a charisma, right? Like a je ne sais quoi. Well, Mary definitely had that. She had everyone kind of in her thrall from the time she lands there. She does it through personality, but her political importance is also pivotal to that, or key to that charisma, because her future father-in-law, the King of France, Henry II, is hoping that by marrying his son to Mary Queen of Scots, he will eventually get control of Scotland and England. So he is using Mary as a way to achieve his imperial ambitions. And that is one of the ways in which Mary is quite representative, again, of the condition of young royal girls at the time, is that they are used as pawns. They, through marriage, men, kings, or, men who are the patriarchs of powerful families can build their empires or their kingdoms or their careers. So this happens over and over again. So she's not ugly.
Yeah, she's
not ugly. She's gorgeous, and everyone loves her. But I think that, even possibly quite early on, that was a little bit of a thorn in Catherine's side, because, I don't know how she felt about the fact that, Mary commanded so much attention, even as a young child, sometimes at the expense of her own children.
So Mary, Queen of Scots, is married to the firstborn son, the heir, right?
Yes, Francis, who will become Francis II. Yes.
And he is kind of a sickly kid, right? And he doesn't survive.
Yeah, these are these things that sometimes it is so hard to kind of get a really authentic picture, because a lot of our understanding of these people has been affected by the reporting in the centuries since, right? And that reporting through propaganda or history is often very influenced by various different agendas. So, Francis, by the time he becomes king, well, he's only 15 when he becomes king, and he doesn't last very long, just 18 months, and then he does die because he is sick. But because he only reigned for a short time, we have less of a true picture than we would have had he lived for longer. So, he seems to be. All the French royal children seem to be fairly robust when they're young. Sure, they get sick, childhood illnesses, and they've got some issues, but they do live. And a lot of children. We're dealing with a period of time when a lot of children die. A lot before the age of 7. So the fact that, Francis lives into his teens shows that he couldn't have been so sickly, right?
Yeah.
But he's immature. and again, if you kind of look at these young teenage boys, mature like girls at different rates. And he just is a little bit on the immature side, both physically and emotionally, I think. So when he inherits the throne, he's completely unprepared. And Mary is also completely unprepared.
And when he dies, that's the end of her time in France. Like, she goes back, or is she?
Yes. Nope. Okay. That is the end of her time in France. She's about 18 years old. And, she's at that point considered the Queen Dowager, meaning she's the widow of the king who has died. She does not succeed in getting pregnant when she is with Francis. Had she had a child, that child would have become the next, well, if that child was a boy, that child would have become the next king of France. And maybe then that would have been a reason for her to stay in France. But she doesn't have the child. So she's kind of, wandering for a little while in France. And she did have the option to stay. But eventually, partially in response to the demands of her Scottish subjects, and also because she's pushed by her French family, her French relatives, the Guise, to return to Scotland and take charge there. But the thing is that while she lived in France, Mary really let the adults around her rule Scotland. So her mother, whose name was Marie de Guise, stayed in Scotland and effectively ruled Scotland in Mary's place. And then she also got a lot of advice from her French uncles, the Guises, who were very, very powerful in France. And so, she kind of lets the adults do the ruling. So she herself never really gets a great education in how to do this. And then she's thrust back, in Scotland and has to take over.
And her story, I feel like most people learn her story from that point forward because of her tension with Queen Elizabeth I of England.
Yes.
And, there's been many films that have dramatized that experience and life. So her life has a pretty tragic end with at least an accusation of treason.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I think that all of that tragedy has something to do with her childhood in France. I think, like you said it earlier, France was really her country. She's raised to be a French young woman. And more importantly, she's raised to be the queen consort of France, which is an exalted position. And France is a very old kingdom. It's much more important than Scotland. It was really, the pinnacle of Mary's success to become the French queen consort, even more so than the reigning queen of Scotland. So she's used to this idea, right? Like, she's the it girl, she's in the spotlight, she's the French queen consort, and she's the reigning queen of Scotland. And then she goes back to Scotland and she doesn't have it anymore. She doesn't have that, French crown anymore. The English crown that she wants so badly is kind of in her sights, but she doesn't have it yet. She's got this crown of Scotland, which is really important to her, but it's not as good as the crown of France. And it seemed to me that all she wants is to be back where she used to be. Like she kind of has this identity crisis. And the rest of her life, the rest of her story is about trying to get back to that place that she once was, both mentally and possibly even physically.
I'm sure that identity crisis, like, that must come through in letters or things that she exchanges with her French family or with the Medici royal family,
Yeah. Well, pretty quickly, Mary starts to realize that Catherine de Medici doesn't trust her. So she's, there is this kind of wall that gets put up in the letters. But when Mary does need help, which she does a lot when she gets back to Scotland, you definitely hear that in the letters. And she's constantly calling upon their history together and their former relationship. And the other thing, the little inkling that to me is just so sad and tragic is that So Mary was I don't think I've explained this, but so Mary on her father's side is Scottish, but on her mother's side, she's effectively French. The Guise family, that other side, and they're actually from Lorraine, which is an independent duchy, but for all intents and purposes, they are a French family. And they're also related to, distantly to the French royal family. So Mary is very close to her French grandmother. And whenever Mary has a problem in Scotland, she says, maybe I could go and live for a time with my grandmother in France. Like you just sense this sort of pining, this kind of desire. And she often looks to her when no one else will help her, she often looks to her grandmother for advice. Because she had, immense respect for her grandmother, but that grandmother was also very much kind of a mother figure for her. So yeah, you feel this longing in the letters.
I know that tragic story. She's, forced to she has 2 more marriages in her short time in Scotland. She's forced to abdicate the throne because of all the Scottish people who politically dominate things and whatever, and then ultimately is imprisoned and executed by her cousin, right? Which is just like the worst end to a life, as you're like already depressed and pining for France. But what I don't know about is what happens to Catherine de Medici's daughter, who lives only 23 years. So what happens to her in this song?
Okay. So one of the reasons why the book ends when it does in 1568 is because that's the year of the downfall of both the young queens, Mary Queen of Scots and Elisabeth de Valois. But Elisabeth de Valois' downfall is very, very different. Some would say it's not even a downfall; it's just a tragic death. So Elizabeth, yes, no one's heard of her unless you really study the period. The reason why, no, understandably. So she's Catherine de Medici's first daughter and second child. And daughters are as important as sons in a royal family. Certainly in a royal family like the French royal family, you have to understand that girls and women cannot inherit the throne in France. Unlike Spain, unlike Scotland, unlike England, you cannot have a ruling queen of France. So sons are super important to the French, but daughters are also important for the same reason why they're important everywhere else, because they are used to make dynastic alliances. And Elizabeth is married at 13 to Philip II of Spain, who is quite famous because of the Armada, right? His dealings with Elizabeth Tudor later on. At the time, she's 13 and Philip is 33 years old. He's 20 years older than her, and Elizabeth is slated to be his third wife. And the reason why they're getting married, and this shows the political importance of young girls, is that her marriage is part of a peace treaty ending generations of war between France and Spain. These wars are called the Italian Wars. I know it's totally confusing, but that's because France and Spain are fighting over territories in Italy. They're fighting for domination of Italy. So, by the time 1559 rolls around, Henry II of France and Philip II of Spain are tired of these wars. They've depleted their treasuries, and the Reformation is picking up, particularly in France. And so Henry II is very nervous about that, and he wants to turn all his attention to what's going on in France. So Elizabeth is married as part of this peace treaty, and she is sent off to Spain. But the whole marriage is basically built on a very traumatic event, because at her wedding, during the celebrations, her father, Henry II, decides he wants to impress the Spanish, and he's going to fight in the tournaments, or he's going to ride in the tournaments, a joust. And there's a horrible freak accident, and he's mortally injured and dies 10 days later. And that's the moment where his son, Francis, takes over with his wife, Mary Queen of Scots, and she becomes the Queen Consort of France. But, Elizabeth has just gotten married. And she's 13 years old. No one will know if the peace treaty is going to hold. Finally, Catherine, who she tried to delay and keep Elizabeth in France for a little bit longer. But finally, Catherine is forced to send Elizabeth to Spain. And so Elizabeth, basically rides into Spain on the heels of this very traumatic event and leaves behind both a mother who is grieving and a kingdom, her home kingdom of France, which is kind of in disarray because of the recent death of her father. So that's how her married life begins. And you can imagine, she's only 13 years old. She's still playing with toys and dolls and with her little girlfriends. Like, we have evidence of this. And one of the most astounding things about Elisabeth de Valois is that we actually have a ton of documentation about her years in Spain, particularly around her health and her relationship with her ladies in waiting and her relationship with her mother. And that is because, as I said before, Catherine de Medici was very much a helicopter parent. She's a controlling mom. She has spies in Spain, but she also has very, very loyal ambassadors and female diplomats who will report everything to her. And she wants to know everything that's going on with Elizabeth. So we have this wonderful paper trail of information. Now, just to give Catherine a little bit of a break, she's a controlling mom, but you can kind of understand it because now, her teenage son has just inherited the throne of France, and she really wants to make sure that Elizabeth is settled and that the peace treaty remains intact between France and Spain. So it's really important for her that Elizabeth succeed as queen in Spain in order to keep that peace going between the two kingdoms. The problem is that Elizabeth, like her mother, has an infertility problem for years and years. She cannot get pregnant. And for a woman who's in the position of queen consort, that is a terrible place to be, because a woman's security in court on the throne as the wife to the king is only assured if she gives birth to the heir. Otherwise, she could be repudiated. She could be sent back. And Catherine is terrified that that's what's going to happen, that Philip II is going to see her daughter as damaged goods and send her back, and then the peace treaty will falter. Do you want me to go on?
I don't know. I need to know. I should have Googled this because now I need to know. So does she
eventually get pregnant? Yes, she does.
Okay.
Oh, she does. And Catherine tries to help in every way that she can. Actually, some of this correspondence is so touching because Catherine is like the mother you kind of don't want, but also the mother you do want, and also the mother-in-law that no man wants. She is really meddling and, definitely tries to impose herself. And, Elizabeth does grow up. She is always very attached to her mother. And this kind of annoys Philip II. But she does manage to kind of, eventually, create some distance, which you can imagine in some ways is a little bit easier to do then than now, because correspondence is all through letter. It takes weeks, to receive or send anything. And when Elizabeth gets to Spain, she's still a young teenager. So Philip and the rest of the Spanish court really have a good opportunity to mold her into a Spanish queen, which they effectively do. Even so, Elizabeth does remain quite faithful to France. And in some ways, this was really expected of her, and actually of all royal women, is that they were expected to be the intermediary between families. So Elizabeth does advocate for France, but she also advocates for Spain. In that way, you can kind of see how the position of wife, certainly a royal wife, is very much a diplomatic one. She comes to embody that kind of idea of compromise between the two kingdoms. Even so, she really does have to get pregnant and bear a child. So she does get pregnant. But the thing is that Elizabeth is only able to give birth to girls. no fault of hers, right? But that's what happens. So it's not perfect, but a couple of things, keep Elisabeth in Philip's good graces. First of all, he really likes her. It's not clear that he really cared that much about her early on, but he really grows to like her. And actually the whole Spanish court, they really love Elisabeth. She really charmed them. Philip already has a son by his first wife. His name is Don Carlos, who's also kind of famous and notorious and has been mythologized. But Don Carlos is, we're not quite sure the nature of his disability, but he's disabled in some way. He's very unstable. And so Philip realizes that Don Carlos is probably not going to be the young man who can inherit the throne of Spain. So that does put more pressure on Elisabeth. She only does have girls, but even so, once a woman is able to get pregnant and have a child, even if that child is a girl, it still bodes well that maybe she eventually could have a boy in the future. That is what sort of underlies the whole saga of Henry VIII, right? It's like when his queens do get pregnant, he still hopes that eventually they will have a boy. Same thing is true in other countries as well. But Elisabeth dies when she's 23 because of complications in her third pregnancy. And so another interesting detail about Elisabeth that I don't think I've quite said yet is that we have a lot of information about her physical health because Catherine de Medici was writing about it all the time. And Elisabeth struggled a lot. Actually, a lot of these young women struggle physically, which might have something to do with the stress of being a young royal woman at the time. But Elisabeth really does. She has a number of health problems, and they really rear their head during her third pregnancy. And ultimately, it kills her. So the tragedy is that, to do her duty as a queen, she has to get pregnant. She has to bear a child. But in the end, that could be the thing that kills you. And this is true not just of her, but of any woman in the Renaissance. I mean, the rates of mortality in childbirth are extremely high. And so most women, certainly royal women or aristocratic women, write their wills while they're pregnant, before they go into labor, because they know there's a good chance that they will die.
So it's kind of interesting that you ended there, because she's dying doing like her job as a woman in that time,
Yeah. Well, the subtitle, so my subtitle of the book's called Young Queens, but the subtitle is 3 Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. And I chose that subtitle because I wanted to put the emphasis on the women, right? Mm-hmm. Like, yes, these are particular queens, some of whom you've heard of and others you haven't, but these are first and foremost women, and their stories are often echoed in the stories of other women, of the time period. And then the second half of the subtitle is the price of power, because in the end, there is a cost to all this, and that cost, has many different faces. But certainly for Elisabeth, you pay that price with your own life. That's what you do.
Yeah. Well, definitely Mary Queen of Scots too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, the real irony, the paradox with Mary Queen of Scots is that she does give birth to a boy successfully, but then that child is what allows her enemies to depose her. She does what she's supposed to do, but she loses anyways.
Wow. Well, I'm sitting here going, there's so many things that I could ask you, but I feel like people just need to read your book because this is so cool. And I think, going back to the earlier commentary about how important this is, especially in the United States, I think there's sort of like if it came before US history, could it really be that important? And yes is the answer. And I think one of the things that's so crucial about all of these characters, that if there's people that are like, yeah, that's interesting, but like, I don't really know how to incorporate it, is that, Philip, who we were just talking about, goes to war with Queen Elizabeth because she executes Mary Queen of Scots, and also to sort of like, spread Catholicism and take out the Protestant queen and all those things. Right. And he loses And I think had he not lost that conflict, we might be speaking Spanish right now. Like, well, so I think there's a lot of consequences of this period.
All of that goes back. Had Elisabeth de Valois lived, she might have been able to help Mary. In fact, I don't want to give too much away, but Mary asks Elisabeth for help, but it's too late, Yeah. And there are a number of things, but also in terms of today, I wrote this book as someone who's quite informed by, sort of a feminist approaches to history, to literature, and sort of thematically, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize here is the ways in which women, young women and women's bodies have always been politicized. I mean, that is something that we are grappling with. And I am trying to bring forward in this book is that, young women's bodies have always been politicized with huge political consequences. That has always been part of, establishing these systems of power. So thematically, I do think that there are a number of parallels with today, even if, it seems like it's from long ago.
Well, that's an amazing way to end, I think. How can people find your book? Where is it?
Anywhere that you buy your books, Amazon or independent bookstores, or through Farrar, Straus and Giroux, who's publishing the US edition. Really, anywhere you can find a book, you will find Young Queens. So I hope that readers enjoy it.
Oh, well, I can't wait. I can't wait to share this with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been really fun to talk about it.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.